This video is going to be about HPA setups and AEG setups and the pros and cons to both, because there's a lot of differences involved when you're talking about HPA systems versus an AEG gun. And keep in mind when we're talking about this, both of us, CAD and Ordo, have ran HPA setups for many years, and same thing with AEG. So we know the pros and cons of both because we both used the two different platforms for many different games, many different events. So we know what we're talking about with these different platforms. So first thing we're going to compare as far as HPAs versus AEGs is performance, which is what everyone looks for in a platform when they're looking to buy a gun or what setup they're planning on going with. So as far as the AEGs go, you're never going to get as good of trigger response as an HPA, but you'll get close. But what you want to look for when you build an AEG is, do you have the knowledge in order to build it? So if you don't have the knowledge, then you're going to have a shop build it for you, and that's going to be more expensive. But you can build these AEGs to have very close trigger response to an HPA setup. And FPS wise, as far as field use, as long as you buy a quality gun, you're not going to have any issues with FPS. Consistency, it's going to be just the mechanical nature of an AEG is going to be a little bit lower as far as consistency of FPS goes. Like the volume of air is not going to be exactly the same every time like HPA.
Alright, so for HPAs, like we have the 4CRL right here. For performance wise, there's really not any downsides. You're going to have pretty much the best trigger response that you can get. You're going to have very good FPS. The FPS, for example, with this system is not going to be the same as an FPS with AEG. It's not going to vary as much. So with a PolarStar, each pull of the trigger is within about 4 FPS, maybe even less of each other. Whereas an AEG, depending on the spring life, the FPS could vary a little bit, which for normal field use would not really cause a difference in performance. But if you're operating at long ranges, the performance could decrease because obviously if there's a variability in FPS, your BB is not going to have as consistent of a travel path. And then another thing for performance is there's very little maintenance to do with a PolarStar. They're very reliable. You know when you're going to take them out of the box, you plug your battery in, you plug your air in, and that's pretty much it. There's no real maintenance besides maybe lubing a few O-rings, whereas on an AEG you might have to fix a gear if you break a gear, maybe put a lipo that's a little bit too powerful in it. Alright, so our next category for comparing HPA versus AEG is going to be adjustability. So first let's talk about HPA. Adjustability on this gun, this has a fusion engine in it. It's a Gen 1 fusion engine. Adjustability is very good because you can change out your nozzles, and this thing right here can fire anywhere from 200 FPS all the way up to 600 FPS if you hypothetically wanted to turn it up that high with a purple nozzle. Also, you can adjust your poppet. You can adjust numerous amount of settings in the FCU, and also it has a closed bolt mode and open bolt mode. So those are two different modes where without getting too much into it, you fire it and it already has the other BB loaded into the hop up. So that can be also good for trigger response, making it that much better. But this fusion engine is great for if you're putting it in a gun like this, where I can use it as a DMR, and then also if I wanted to go indoor, turn it way down. If you have a field that has a really low FPS limit, you could turn it way down, put say a gold nozzle in there or something like that. If you're going for air efficiency, You can switch out, throw a gold poppet in there, or whichever poppet you choose. And you can really just, if you have a chrono, you can really just dial it in the way that you want. A lot of guys like to use it for air efficiency. They get these really small air tanks, and then they go for the most efficient gun that they could possibly make. They seal everything in. They O-ring around the hop up, stuff like that. You could go for a DMR where you're not really concerned about air consumption. You're just going for high FPS and high accuracy. Or you can go anywhere in between. So this is really one of the best systems out there for adjustability when you're thinking about having one gun that does it all. Whereas with an AEG, it would be very, very hard to have one gun that does all these things. There are some disadvantages, but we'll get into that in the next section.
Alright, so adjustability with AEGs. Now, this Arcturus AK right here is one of the most adjustable AEGs because it has a quick change spring system. So if I want to go play indoor and the limit's 400, we'll say, all I have to do is put the stock spring back in. But if I want to go be a DMR at a field, outdoor field, all I have to do is throw in a spring like this M150 right here. Boom, it takes less than 2 minutes and I have a DMR set up. But as far as AEGs that don't have a quick change spring, you're gonna have to take out the gearbox, split the gearbox shell, and change out the spring in order if you want to change the FPS that much. So it's not as simple as a HPA setup, but if you get a quick change spring gun like this, then it's going to be perfect for you if you want an AEG that's adjustable, and springs don't cost that much either. So that's pretty much, if you want to adjust the FPS on an AEG, most of it is in the spring. That's like kind of like the heart of the AEG. That's what controls how hard the piston moves forward when it slams.
All right, so our next category for HPA versus AEG is going to be mobility. So how easily you can move around, operate when using your gun on a field. So first we're going to talk about HPA. So HPA, this is the first category where we're going to have some major disadvantages. So with HPA, the big downside is that you do have to have a HPA tank. So there's a variety of ways you can mount the HPA tank, but typically players will have a large tank such as this, like a 68 4500, and they'll mount it in a backpack with a regulator, kind of like this one you see here. And that regulator is connected to the gun using a line. So that line will typically be routed out of the backpack, either under your arm or over your arm, and then to the gun. And this is obviously different from a paintball gun because the tank is not mounted directly on the gun, which some people see as a benefit because the tank does not weigh the gun down. But a lot of airsoft guns obviously are electric, so airsoft players, to them, a tank is going to be a major disadvantage because if you're walking around, the line could get caught on branches or trees. Sometimes it gets caught on other players' gear, and then you end up tripping and falling because your line got caught on them. So there's a number of different ways to combat it. You can zip tie the line to your gear, or you can route it through your webbing. But basically, that's a major disadvantage. A lot of people, they decide not to get the PolarStar, not because of the cost of it, but because of the line, and the line gets in the way, and they're worried about it getting tangled on stuff, especially if you're going to a major op when you're in a factory or something like that, and there's metal that it could get caught on, and it's basically a tangle hazard. So one thing that PolarStar did to combat that, as they have the air stock now, we don't have it on this gun right here, but essentially it's a stock with a very small HPA tank built into it. The downside to that system is that you have to be very air efficient because you will have to change out your tanks throughout the day if you're not. Um, so, in my opinion, the line really isn't that much of a hassle. So I typically just use this setup. I use a normal stock, and then I'll use my 68 4500 tank just because I like being able to use it for 4 days and not having to fill it. Um, yeah, I'll just use that, and then typically I'll route it through my webbing, and I'll have some bungee cords tying it to me so that way it doesn't really get in the way. But just keep in mind, if you do want to get a PolarStar, it is a major downside is the mobility of the gun.
Alright, so this is a category where AEGs are actually better than HPA guns. You don't have to carry around a tank everywhere. You don't have to worry about a line. All you have to do is plug a battery in and you're ready to roll. You don't have to worry about taking up backpack space if you're going to an op, because anyone who goes to an op knows that sometimes you got to carry around other junk, and if you don't have to carry an HPA tank, then you can carry other stuff with you. As the AG, all you have to do, bring a battery, maybe you have to bring another spare battery. It goes inside the gun, doesn't, can't get tangled on anything, so you have nothing to worry about as far as mobility with an AG. So ease of use. This is another. This is the second category, or the AG gun wins. You can't get any more simple. All you gotta do is charge the battery. Charge the battery, and you plug it in, and you're ready to play for the day. A lot of people just like that. Can't get any more simple than that. Just, you got spare batteries, can't go wrong. HPA, again, you have to charge this battery over there, which is simple. Just charge the battery for the FCU. Some HPA setups are even mechanical, so you're not even going to have to worry about that, depending on what system you get. And then obviously, you got to make sure your HPA tank is filled. That's the only difference between AG and HPA. Both got a charged battery, but HPA just got to make sure your tank is filled up. So they're both pretty easy to use.
All right, so our next category is going to be cost. So first, we're going to talk about the HPA. So for the HPA, you have three types of costs. You have the initial cost, you have the other additional equipment cost, and then you have the maintenance cost. So for the initial cost, that's going to be the cost of the actual unit. So depending on what you could get a PolarStar Fusion engine, whether it's Gen 1 or Gen 2. You could get a F1, you could get a Wolverine SMP, you could get, there's a variety of different systems out there. Redline has one now. So the initial cost is that, and then in order to get your gun to work, obviously you have to install it. So we save some money, we install ours on our own. If you have a tech install it, you're going to accrue some charges. And then you have to hook it up. So what you need is you need a tank, you need an airline, and then you need a regulator. And you're also going to need a battery depending on which system you use. Some of the systems now are purely mechanical and they don't require a battery. However, we would recommend you get a PolarStar because of the adjustability and specifically the PolarStar Fusion engine. Just keep in mind, if you do get one of these other systems like the Jack or the Redline system, you're gonna have a HPA gun, but you're not gonna have that adjustability that you get with the PolarStar. Because with the PolarStar, you can adjust your nozzle, you can adjust your poppet, you can adjust all these other settings. So when you do purchase it, just keep in mind, whichever one you purchase will probably last a very long time. So you might as well just buy the best one, because if you buy a lesser one and then 3 years down the line you want another one, you're going to end up spending more money than you would have if you would have just bought the best one in the first place. All right, so another cost with the PolarStar systems, the other HPA systems, is you're going to be your filling costs. So that filling your air tanks, filling your CO2 tanks, whatever you have. Typically, people will go to their local scuba shop or their local field, and at least around here in the Northeast where we are, typically filling a tank costs around $10 for a 4,000 psi tank. So, which $10 you don't think that's a lot, but when you're filling it twice a month, 3 times a month, that gets to be quite expensive when you compare it to, say, an AEG, which doesn't have a tank. So that's not to say you shouldn't buy a PolarStar. That's just to say it might not be the best to have someone else fill your tanks. So what we ended up doing is we bought a small air compressor online for a few $100s, and we fill our own tanks now. So essentially, that air compressor is paying for itself because every time we fill a tank, it's worth $10. Or I've even heard of some fields charging $15 or $20 to fill a tank, which is completely ridiculous. And I think I would recommend it to any HPA player just to get that air compressor in order to fill your own tanks, offset that cost, and then you can throw that money into something else like upgrades, hop up, or just field fees.
So the cost of AEGs, I think, is a little bit depending on which how high of a end AEG you get. It's going to be less than HPA. The cost is just going to be overall less. But just like with HPA, you got to buy some extras like the tank, the line. Same thing with AEG. AEG, you got to buy a few batteries. If you don't have a charger already, you got to buy a charger. And that's pretty much it. But if you're going to get like a beginner AEG, it's not that expensive. It's going to reflect that in the performance. Usually, when you see the price of an AEG, usually that price will reflect the performance. So if you buy a $200 AEG, it's going to shoot like a $200 AEG. If you buy a $600 AEG, it's going to be a Ripper AEG. And another thing I want to talk about is if you either have a gun built for you or build your own gun. So as far as like maxed out setups, the cost between HPA and AEG is going to be very similar if you either buy a pre-built AEG or have someone build it for you. If you build your own AEG, you're gonna save a lot of money and then the price will be significantly less for a built AEG rather than an HPA gun. But in order to build your own AEG, it's not as simple as a HPA setup. There's a lot more moving parts. There's a lot of tuning and tinkering and trial and error. You got to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you can mess some serious stuff up and cost you a lot of money. So don't try to build your own AEG if you don't know what you're doing. But if you have that knowledge, you can save a lot of money, and you don't have to fill tanks. That's not going to cost you. All you have to do is buy a battery, charger, and you're good to go. And maintenance costs, obviously you can't get any more maintenance free than an HPA gun. There's like a few moving parts in the whole system, and all the maintenance is really on HPA stuff is lubricating some O-rings, whereas the cost on AEG still really isn't that much, but you gotta grease stuff every once in a while, grease the gears, lubricate some O-rings and stuff like that. Still isn't that much, but slightly higher than the PolarStar. But if you do go with the HPA setup, we really do recommend fill your own tanks. It will save you a lot of money in the long run. And if you want to go AEG route, then and you want to get like a maxed out AEG, you'd suggest if you want to save a lot of money, do your research online before you start buying stuff and building it yourself. Just make sure you know what you're doing, and you'll build it and you'll save a lot of money.
Alright guys, so we hope you guys found this video informative. So bottom line is, no matter which setup you go with, there's the right way and the wrong way to do it. And there's the expensive way to do it, which is to buy something for either one, to buy something lower quality, and then later on down the line, buy something higher quality, and it will end up being more expensive because you bought two things instead of just buying one thing. So we like to use the saying, buy once, cry once. So no matter which one you choose to do, just apply that, and you're going to end up with a great setup. If you guys have a setup that you like to share, possibly a third setup, let us know in the comments, and we'll probably be doing a video at some point on different HPA setups versus different AEG setups, long range versus short range, DMR versus indoor setups. So if you guys want to see that video, let us know, and we'll see you guys in the next one.